I'm warning you, participating in this meeting will be the end of your career. French Ambassador Marcel Dubois's threat echoed from the video conference screen. 12 African leaders listened in silence. Ibrahim Traoré stood up. Ambassador Dubois, for 60 years you've been telling us what we can and cannot do. His voice was calm but determined. Tonight, we will make decisions without your permission. He turned off the screen. The leaders in the room looked at each other. My friends, said Traoré, Africa's true independence begins at this table. 3 weeks earlier, at midnight in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré sat in the secure room of the presidential palace. The weight of what he was about to initiate pressed heavily on his shoulders. On his mahogany desk were 11 letters, each one meticulously crafted and sealed with wax, to be sent by special couriers. Each letter was addressed to the leader of a different African country, but these weren't ordinary diplomatic correspondences. These letters would change the course of African history. Dr. Cone, said Traoré, turning to his most trusted advisor Dr. Aminata Cone, a brilliant economist who had studied at both Sorbonne and Harvard before returning to serve her homeland. We will send these letters with personal couriers. No intelligence service, no diplomatic channel, no electronic communication should be aware of this meeting. The future of our continent depends on absolute secrecy. Dr. Cone adjusted her glasses, a habit she developed during years of analyzing complex economic data. Mr. President, why is such extraordinary secrecy necessary? After all, the African Union has regular meetings, ECOWAS summits happen frequently. What makes this different? Traoré walked to the bulletproof window, looking out at the city lights of Ouagadougou, where ordinary citizens slept peacefully, unaware that their president was orchestrating what could be the most significant political move in modern African history. Aminata, there's something I've never told you, something so sensitive that I couldn't risk putting it in any official report. Last month at the African Union meeting in Addis Ababa, I had a private meeting with Mali President Assimi Dembele. What he showed me changed everything I thought I knew about our continent's relationship with the Western world. He walked to his personal safe, a German-made titanium vault that required both his fingerprint and a complex numeric code. From inside, he retrieved a small USB drive that looked innocuous but contained information worth billions of dollars. This USB contains detailed documentation of the real value of raw materials extracted from the African continent over the past 20 years and their actual destinations. The numbers are not just shocking, Aminata, they're criminal. Every year, raw materials worth $200 billion are extracted from Africa, but only $15 billion returns to our countries in the form of payments, royalties, and development aid. Dr. Cone's eyes widened as she processed the implications. So where does the remaining $185 billion go? That's nearly the entire GDP of Nigeria. Exactly. And that's precisely why I'm organizing this meeting to answer this question. In the documents Dembele found through his intelligence sources, there are detailed records of agreements Western companies made with African countries. Transfer pricing schemes that allow companies to declare profits in tax havens, tax evasion methods that have been refined over decades, corruption networks that involve not just African officials but European and American executives. All of it systematically planned and executed over generations. The next morning, as the sun rose over Burkina Faso, 11 different couriers embarked on carefully planned routes across the continent. Each was a trusted member of Traoré's inner circle, individuals who had proven their loyalty through years of service. They dressed as businesspeople, tourists, or visiting relatives, carrying nothing more suspicious than ordinary luggage and tourist documents. The destinations of the letters were strategically chosen based on both geopolitical importance and the personal relationships Traoré had cultivated: Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Senegal, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, Chad, Cameroon, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The letters, written in Traoré's own hand to avoid any digital trail, contained these carefully crafted lines: My esteemed colleague and brother, the time has come for an urgent consultation about the economic independence of the African continent. Recent discoveries have revealed information that, when combined with intelligence available to various African governments, will enable us to create a comprehensive plan that reveals our continent's true potential and provides a path to genuine sovereignty. This meeting cannot be organized through official diplomatic channels for reasons that will become clear when we meet. I invite you to join me in Dakar on March 15th at a private facility where we can speak freely and plan our continent's future without foreign interference. Specific details and security protocols will be conveyed verbally by my personal representative. Meanwhile, in Senegal, President Macky Sall's special advisor Colonel Cheikh Ba was making unprecedented security arrangements. A former French Foreign Legion officer who had later become disillusioned with France's policies in Africa, Ba had been tasked with finding and securing a location that could host the most sensitive political meeting in modern African history. The villa he selected was a masterpiece of discretion, located 30 kilometers outside Dakar, surrounded by 50 hectares of private land, positioned on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean with clear sight lines in all directions to prevent surveillance. Mr. President, Colonel Ba reported to Macky Sall during their morning briefing, the villa has been thoroughly swept and secured. We've installed military-grade signal jamming equipment that will create a 500-meter dead zone around the property. No satellite phones, no GPS devices, no electronic surveillance equipment will function within that perimeter. Additionally, I've positioned our most trusted security personnel at strategic points, all of whom believe they're protecting a private business conference. Macky Sall, who had been skeptical when he first received Traoré's letter, now understood the gravity of what was being planned. Chike, you have no comprehension of the historical significance of what we're about to undertake. If what Traoré claims in his preliminary briefing is accurate, the decisions made in this villa could reshape not just Africa, but global economic relationships. We're potentially looking at the end of economic colonialism as we know it. On the evening of March 15th, as the West African sun began its descent toward the Atlantic horizon, African leaders began arriving at the villa in carefully orchestrated sequences. Each came via different routes, some flying into Dakar's international airport at different times, others arriving overland from neighboring countries, a few even traveling by private boat to small coastal landing points. The security measures were unlike anything previously seen for an African political gathering. Phones and all electronic devices were collected at a checkpoint 2 kilometers from the villa, specially prepared short-range communication devices were distributed to each delegation, and every vehicle was swept for tracking devices. Ibrahim Traoré, dressed in a simple dark suit rather than his usual military attire, personally greeted each leader at the villa's main entrance. This wasn't just protocol, it was his way of emphasizing that this meeting was between equals, between brothers, not between a host and guests. The penultimate arrival was Kenyan President William Ruto, who gripped Traoré's hand firmly and said, "Ibrahim, your message spoke of discoveries that would change everything. I've cancelled 3 international commitments to be here." The final arrival was Nigerian President Bola Tinubu, whose presence was crucial given Nigeria's position as Africa's largest economy. "Ibrahim," Tinubu said, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had spent decades in African politics, "I hope this meeting justifies the considerable risks we're all taking by gathering in secret." "Brother Bola," Traoré replied, placing both hands on Tinubu's shoulders in the traditional African greeting, "the information you'll discover tonight will fundamentally alter your understanding of Africa's place in the global economy. More importantly, it will show us a path to genuine economic independence that our predecessors could only dream of." The villa's main conference room had been transformed into something between a war room and a traditional African palaver space. A large oval table crafted from Senegalese rosewood dominated the center, surrounded by 12 high-back chairs, each positioned to ensure every participant could see both the others and the large screens that had been installed on 2 walls. African maps, both historical and contemporary, covered the remaining wall space, while the most important technological elements sat in the center of the table: a military-grade laptop, a high-definition projector, and 3 USB flash drives that would reveal secrets worth trillions of dollars. As the leaders settled into their seats, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation and nervous energy. These were men who controlled the destinies of over 800 million people, who commanded resources that powered global industries, yet most sensed they were about to learn how little real power they actually wielded. The room fell silent as Traoré stood to begin, but before he could speak, something unprecedented happened. The main screen in the salon suddenly illuminated without any command from the room's occupants. The face of French Ambassador Marcel Dubois appeared, his expression a mixture of condescension and barely controlled anger. Every person in the room froze. This was supposed to be impossible. All electronic surveillance had been neutralized, all communication signals blocked. Yet somehow, the French diplomatic service had penetrated their security. "Esteemed leaders," Dubois began, his tone carrying the arrogance of someone accustomed to dictating terms to African governments, "we are fully aware of this unauthorized gathering. As the representative of France, a nation that has maintained stable and productive relationships with African countries for over 6 decades, I must express our serious concerns about any clandestine political activities that could threaten regional stability." Ghana President Nana Akufo-Addo, a lawyer by training who had fought for African independence in international courts, stood up immediately. "Ambassador Dubois, this is an outrageous violation of sovereignty. This is a private meeting between African heads of state. You have absolutely no legal authority to monitor or interfere with our discussions." But Dubois continued, his voice rising with the threatening tone that had intimidated African leaders for generations. "I'm warning you, participating in this meeting will be the end of your career. The French government, in coordination with our European Union partners and NATO allies, will not tolerate activities that undermine the carefully constructed international agreements that have maintained peace and prosperity in this region. Economic sanctions, suspension of development aid, freezing of international assets, these are just the beginning of the consequences you will face." Mali President Assimi Dembele, whose country had experienced firsthand the reality of French military intervention, slammed his clenched fist on the rosewood table with such force that the USB drives jumped. "For 60 years you've been telling us what we can and cannot do. For 60 years you've treated sovereign African nations like children who need European permission to make decisions about our own resources, our own futures." The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Some leaders looked toward the exits, calculating whether they should abandon this meeting before it destroyed their international relationships. Others leaned forward, energized by the confrontation. But all eyes ultimately turned to Ibrahim Traoré, the youngest president in the room, the man who had called this gathering and now faced the moment that would define not just this meeting, but possibly his entire political legacy. Ibrahim Traoré stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. When he spoke, his voice carried a quiet strength that seemed to fill every corner of the room. "Ambassador Dubois, for 60 years you've been telling us what we can and cannot do. For 60 years, France and its Western allies have treated African leaders as provincial governors rather than heads of sovereign nations. Tonight, for the first time in 6 decades, we will make decisions about Africa's future without seeking permission from Paris, Washington, or Brussels." Without breaking eye contact with Dubois through the screen, Traoré reached over and pressed the power button on the display. The screen went black, cutting off the French ambassador mid-sentence. The silence that followed was profound and charged with meaning. 12 leaders looked at each other, each understanding that they had just witnessed and participated in a declaration of independence far more significant than any document signed in the 1960s. "My friends," Traoré said, his voice now carrying a note of historic gravitas, "Africa's true independence begins at this table, in this moment, with this decision to stop allowing others to determine our destiny." The weight of what had just transpired settled over the room like morning mist over the African savanna. But Traoré knew that dramatic gestures, while necessary, were insufficient without concrete evidence and practical plans. He moved to the laptop at the center of the table and inserted the first USB drive. As the projector hummed to life, the first document appeared on the wall-mounted screen, and what the leaders saw fundamentally challenged everything they thought they knew about their relationship with the international community. "These documents," Traoré began, his voice now carrying the tone of a professor delivering the most important lecture of his career, "were obtained through channels I cannot disclose, from sources within Western mining and financial corporations operating across our continent. What you're seeing is an internal strategic planning document from a consortium of European and North American companies, dated just 8 months ago." The document header was starkly revealing. Project name, Africa Resource Management Strategy 2020 to 2040 classification, confidential executive level only objective, systematic long-term control of strategic African resources implementation methods, political leverage, economic dependency creation, information warfare, selective infrastructure development. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, whose country had the continent's most sophisticated economy and strongest international ties, leaned forward to read the small print. "Ibrahim, what exactly does this represent? Are you telling us that Western companies have a 20-year plan for controlling African resources?" Traoré clicked to the second page, revealing a detailed breakdown that left several leaders speechless. The document contained a comprehensive list of African countries with numerical ratings. Burkina Faso, 40% political influence, 65% economic leverage. Mali, 70% political influence, 80% economic leverage. Niger, 85% political influence, 90% economic leverage. The list continued through nearly every African nation. "These percentages," Traoré explained, his voice heavy with the weight of revelation, "represent the degree to which political decisions in each country can be influenced or controlled through economic pressure, debt leverage, aid dependency, and direct political manipulation." Essentially, this document is a scorecard showing how successfully each African government has been subordinated to Western corporate interests. Chad President Mahamat Devi, whose oil-rich nation had struggled with debt and political instability for decades, stood up abruptly. "You're telling us that 85% of Chad's political decisions are actually being made by foreign corporations? That my government is essentially implementing policies written in boardrooms in Paris and London? I'm afraid the reality is even worse than that, Mahamat." Traoré clicked to the third page, revealing a continent-wide map that looked like something from a colonial administrative office. Africa was color-coded by resource type and extraction timeline. Gold mining zones in West Africa were marked for accelerated extraction 2024 to 2030. Oil fields in Central Africa were designated for maximum yield protocols through 2035. Mineral deposits across East Africa were labeled with strategic reserve maintenance until global demand peaked. This map, Traoré continued, his anger now barely contained beneath his professional demeanor, shows how our continent's resources will be extracted over the next 15 years. Notice that there are detailed timelines, profit projections, even environmental impact assessments. What you won't find anywhere in this document is any consideration of how this extraction will benefit African people, African economies, or African development priorities. Ivorian President Alassane Ouattara, whose country was one of the world's largest cocoa producers, studied the map intently. Ibrahim, according to this document, our cocoa production is scheduled to increase by 300% over the next decade, but I see no corresponding investment in processing facilities or value-added manufacturing. They want us to triple our raw material exports while remaining dependent on imported finished products. Exactly, Alassane. And that brings us to the second USB, which reveals the financial mechanisms that make this resource extraction possible while keeping African countries economically dependent. Traoré removed the first drive and inserted the second, and what appeared on screen was even more damaging than the resource extraction plans. The new documents were internal communications from the French Treasury, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, written in multiple languages but all conveying the same essential message. The CFA franc system and similar currency arrangements were designed not to facilitate African development, but to ensure continuous wealth transfer from Africa to Europe. Senegal President Macky Sall, whose country had used the CFA franc since independence, began translating one of the French documents aloud. The CFA monetary system continues to provide optimal results for French economic interests. Annual capital transfers from African CFA zones to French financial institutions averaged €52 billion over the past 5 years. Recommendation: maintain current exchange rate mechanisms and debt service requirements to ensure continued capital flow to European markets. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Burkina Faso had left the CFA system, but most of the countries represented in this room were still using currencies designed to transfer their wealth to their former colonial rulers. Cameroon President Paul Biya, at 89 the oldest leader present and someone who had witnessed the entire post-independence period, spoke with a voice of accumulated wisdom and deep bitterness. Ibrahim, I have served my country for over 4 decades. I have negotiated with every French president since Giscard d'Estaing. I always suspected that our monetary agreements were not designed for our benefit, but seeing the actual numbers, the deliberate mechanisms for wealth extraction, it's worse than I imagined. And that, Paul, brings us to why this meeting was necessary, and why we couldn't use normal diplomatic channels. The third USB contains not just more evidence of how we've been systematically exploited, but a comprehensive plan for African economic independence that has been under development for the past 18 months. When Traoré inserted the final USB drive, the screen displayed something unprecedented in modern African politics: a detailed blueprint for complete economic independence from Western financial systems. The document was titled in English, French, Arabic, and Swahili, The African Gold Standard Initiative: A Comprehensive Plan for Monetary Independence Timeline, 18 months to full implementation, participating nations, 12 initial members, expandable to continental coverage. My friends, Traoré said, his voice now filled with excitement and possibility rather than anger, what you're looking at is our path to genuine independence. Not just political independence, which we achieved in the 1960s, but economic independence, which has remained elusive for 6 decades. Kenyan President William Ruto, whose country had one of Africa's most dynamic economies and had pioneered mobile banking technology, studied the technical specifications intently. Ibrahim, this appears to be a completely new monetary system based on African gold reserves. How would this work practically? What about international trade relationships, currency conversion, technological infrastructure? William, those are exactly the right questions, and they have comprehensive answers. Traoré began clicking through detailed technical diagrams that showed a sophisticated financial system. Each participating country would contribute a portion of its gold reserves to a collective African monetary fund. These physical gold deposits would back a new digital currency that could be used for both domestic transactions and international trade between African countries. Nigerian President Tinubu, whose country's economy was larger than many European nations, raised a crucial concern. Ibrahim, Nigeria's economy is heavily integrated with global markets. Our oil exports, our banking system, our international agreements, they're all denominated in dollars and euros. How do we transition without causing economic chaos? Bola, Nigeria is actually the key to making this system work rather than just survive. Your oil revenues, properly managed through the new monetary system, would provide the stability and international credibility that smaller economies need. Instead of selling oil for dollars that immediately leave Africa to pay for imported goods, you would sell oil for African gold standard currency that stays within our continental economy. The next several hours were spent examining every aspect of the proposed system. The technical details were impressive: blockchain-based transaction systems developed by African engineers, mobile banking platforms that could work in rural areas without traditional banking infrastructure, trade agreements already negotiated with China, Russia, India, and Brazil that would accept the new African currency for international transactions. But as the night progressed, the discussion moved beyond technical specifications to the fundamental question of political will. Democratic Republic of Congo President Félix Tshisekedi raised the issue that everyone was thinking about: Ibrahim, what you're proposing is essentially economic warfare against the Western powers that have controlled global finance for centuries. They won't simply allow this to happen. We'll face not just economic retaliation, but potentially military intervention, regime change operations, international isolation. Traoré nodded solemnly. Felix, you're absolutely correct. Which is why success depends on all of us acting together, simultaneously, with careful preparation and ironclad security. If one country attempts this alone, it will be crushed. If 12 countries act together, representing over 800 million people and controlling massive natural resources, the international community will have no choice but to negotiate rather than simply destroy. At this point, Traoré revealed another set of documents that had been prepared with meticulous care. These are draft cooperation agreements with non-Western powers. China has agreed to provide technological infrastructure and accepts African gold as payment for industrial equipment. Russia will supply defense systems and energy technology in exchange for uranium and other minerals. India offers pharmaceutical manufacturing and information technology services. Brazil provides agricultural technology and food security cooperation. The strategic brilliance of the plan became clear. Instead of rejecting all international relationships, the African gold standard would allow African countries to diversify their international partnerships, reducing dependence on any single power bloc while maintaining access to global markets and technology. As dawn approached and the meeting entered its 8th hour, the discussion focused on implementation timelines and security protocols. Ghana President Akufo-Addo, who had remained largely silent while absorbing the complexity of what was being proposed, finally spoke up with a question that went to the heart of African political reality. Ibrahim, assuming we all agree to this plan, and I'm not yet saying we should, how do we implement it without our own governments, our own civil services, our own military officers being compromised by Western intelligence agencies? Some of these documents suggest that foreign intelligence services have penetrated African governments at the highest levels. This question led to perhaps the most sensitive part of the entire discussion. Traoré revealed that the planning for this meeting had included extensive counterintelligence operations in each participating country. Nana, over the past 6 months, my security services have been working quietly with trusted elements in each of your governments to identify which officials have been compromised by foreign intelligence services. The results were disturbing. He displayed a new document that showed organizational charts for each country's government, with certain positions marked in red. The red positions indicate individuals who we have confirmed are reporting to foreign intelligence agencies. In some countries, this includes cabinet ministers, central bank governors, even personal security staff for presidents. The room erupted in shocked conversations as each leader studied the chart for his own country. Some were relieved to see few red marks, others were horrified to discover how extensively their governments had been penetrated. Senegal's Macky Sall summed up everyone's feelings. This explains so much about why our policy initiatives often seem to fail or get modified in ways that benefit foreign interests rather than our own people. The final hours of the meeting were devoted to establishing operational security for the implementation phase. Each country would establish a parallel economic planning structure, staffed only by individuals who had been thoroughly vetted for foreign influence. Communication between countries would use quantum encrypted channels provided by Chinese technology partners. Most importantly, the entire 18-month implementation would be presented to the public and international community as separate, uncoordinated national policies rather than a collective continental strategy. As the sun rose over the Atlantic Ocean, casting long shadows through the villa's windows, 12 African leaders stood around the rosewood table for a moment that would define the next chapter of African history. The decision was not taken lightly. Each leader understood that they were potentially sacrificing their own political careers and possibly their personal safety for the possibility of genuine African independence. Traoré made the closing statement that had been planned for hours but still carried emotional weight. My brothers, over these 8 hours we have learned truths about our continent that our predecessors could only suspect. We have seen evidence of systematic exploitation that has continued for 60 years after our supposed independence. Most importantly, we have developed a practical plan for ending this exploitation and achieving genuine economic sovereignty. The choice before us is simple but not easy. We can return to our countries and continue managing economies designed to benefit others, or we can take the first real steps toward African economic independence since our ancestors were forced into colonial subjugation. Each leader then formally committed to the 18-month implementation timeline. Nigerian President Tinubu was the last to speak. Ibrahim, if this plan succeeds, you will be remembered as the leader who finally completed the independence that Kwame Nkrumah, Thomas Sankara, and Patrice Lumumba died fighting for. If it fails, we may all join them as martyrs to the cause of African freedom. Traoré's response was quiet but determined. Bola, I don't want to be remembered as another martyred African leader. I want to be remembered as the president who lived to see Africa finally control its own destiny. The leaders departed the villa one by one, using the same staggered timing and diverse routes that had brought them there. Each carried encrypted communication devices and detailed implementation manuals. More importantly, each carried the knowledge that Africa's relationship with the global economy was about to change forever. As Ibrahim Traoré's plane lifted off from Dakar airport, he looked down at the West African coastline where millions of his ancestors had been shipped into slavery, where European colonizers had first established the economic relationships that still dominated African life. In 18 months, he reflected, that coastline might finally represent departure points for African wealth going to benefit African people, rather than extraction points for resources enriching foreign economies. The plan was ambitious, dangerous, and unprecedented. But for the first time in 6 decades, it offered a realistic path to the economic independence that political independence had failed to deliver. Whether it would succeed depended on the ability of 12 leaders to transform the most audacious plan in modern African history from secret meeting minutes into continental reality. The countdown to African economic independence had begun.